The year is 1852. Brothers Clement and Henry Studebaker, who were the oldest of the five boys, would open up their own blacksmith shop called H&C for Henry and Clement Studebaker. It's important to note that Studebaker's family history goes back into the 1700s in Germany, known as the Studebaker. They would leave Germany, coming to the United States, landing in Philadelphia Harbor. The guy doing the paperwork had them down as Studebaker, which would be their name from there forth. Anyway, getting back to the blacksmith shop, H&C Blacksmith Shop, it was located at the intersection of Michigan and Jefferson Boulevard in South Bend, Indiana. The first year in business, the pair would build 2 horse-drawn wagons from the ground up. In 1858, Henry's younger brother John Moeller Studebaker would buy Henry out of the wagon business with the money he was able to make in Hangtown. During the gold rush, John set up a shop in Hangtown building gold mining tools and wheelbarrows. Henry was growing tired of the business, and all he really wanted to do was farm. The risk of expansion wasn't for him. So John, along with all of the other brothers except for Henry, would form the Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company. The brothers were able to turn Studebaker into a juggernaut in the wagon world, the world's largest wagon manufacturer. Studebaker built hundreds of wagons for the Union side or the North during the Civil War. Studebaker built all kinds of wagons, from buggies to carriages over the years, building a reputation for building a quality product. Studebaker would pivot to automobiles in 1902, getting into electric cars at first. People think that electric cars are a new construct, but they were here since the beginning. Steam and gasoline were the other 2 common forms of fuel. There were others, but steam, electric, and gasoline were the most common in the beginning. The 1902 Studebaker model was essentially a wagon with an electric motor and was mounted right underneath the seat, with batteries in the rear-wheel drive. The early models used spoke wire wheels from a bicycle. Single-seat models had 1 motor. There was another model, a 4-seat Surrey, which could be had with 2 motors. Studebaker also offered a range of electric delivery vehicles which used 2 motors. Weight carrying capacities varied from 1,000 pounds to 7,500 pounds. In 1903, Studebaker would partner with Garford of Elyria, Ohio. Garford grew out of the Federal Manufacturing Company, which was building various parts for various different cars. Garford took things a step further and began offering complete chassis. Companies that used the Garford chassis included, but not limited to, Gaith, Cleveland, Royal, Rayner, and soon Studebaker would join the list. The man behind Garford was Arthur L. Garford, who made his money in banking. Garford as a car manufacturer didn't exist prior to Studebaker's partnership, and under the agreement, Studebaker-Garford wasn't allowed to make any cars of their own. Which is understandable from Studebaker's perspective because they didn't want to compete with themselves. But Garford really wanted to build cars with their own name on it, and they would for 2 years, 1907 and 1908, so they could compete in the Glidden Tours, which was an early reliability contest. Winning those brutal tours would put that company on the map, so to speak, and give it all kinds of publicity, theoretically drumming up car sales. It was a big deal for car companies to do well in that. Think of it as that era's Motor Trend Award of the year, but it was way bigger than Motor Trend's award is now. Just thinking of something to compare it to. It's important to note that when Garford took part in the Glidden Tours, they were referred to as Garford Studebaker or Studebakers. In 1909, Garford would branch off, making a truck division. The cars that Studebaker would build in partnership with Garford was their gasoline-powered option. Studebaker offered both electric and gasoline-powered vehicles, horseless carriages in 1903. Only 1 model was offered in only one gasoline flavor called the Model A, available in one body style, 5-passenger tonneau, powered by an 8-horsepower 2-cylinder. Electrics had more offerings with a single-seater runabout, Victoria, Surrey, and Stanhope. 1904 offered more body styles for both electric and gasoline. The electrics got the coupe, phaeton, and delivery wagon. New gasoline bodies included but not limited to Model B delivery wagon, Model C 5-passenger tourer. All models used the 2-cylinder 8-horsepower engine. 1905 saw the release of a new 4-cylinder, which was good for 20 horsepower. The cars got bigger with each passing year, with big brass lights. 1905 was the last year for the 2-cylinder. 1906, Studebaker Garford offered 3 series: Series E, Series F, and Series G, all 4-cylinders. The most powerful one yielded 30 horsepower. 1907 through 1911, things get a bit blurry. 1911 would be the last year for the Studebaker-Garford partnership. Garford would build cars and trucks, but the truck company was a separate entity, which we come back to a little bit later in the story. Garford was chopping at the bit to finally be able to build cars with their own name on it. Garford would build cars from 1911 through 1913. They used 4-cylinders and 6-cylinder engines, 30 to 60 horsepower. John North Willys, who worked his way up in sales, selling bicycles. After learning about the automobile in 1899, John knew most people were going to want to drive and not ride their bicycles everywhere. He would open up a car dealer selling Overland automobiles. Overland goes back to 1903, founded by Claude E. Cox and Charles Minshaw of Standard Wheel Company. Standard Wheel Company wanted to expand its product line offering cars. Their car was the Overland. In 1905, Overland production moved to Indianapolis, Indiana. There, David M. Perry would come in as a 51% investor. The company would reorganize as Overland Auto Company and was now an extension of Perry's buggy factory. All of the vehicles being sold were being purchased by one man, John North Willys, who was selling all of the cars at his dealership in Elmira, Ohio. David Perry would go bankrupt in the Panic of 1907, but would recover to the point that he would start his own automobile company, Perry Automobile Company, or Perry Auto Company, and then they would make New Perry. Perry would build 3,500 cars between the years 1910 through 1912. In 1908, John North Willys would buy Overland. The full story is in this episode if you want to know more about it. Meanwhile, a new automobile manufacturer would spawn in Detroit, Michigan in 1908 called EMF. Each letter stood for a founding member, Barney Everett, who made his money as a bodybuilder. William Mentzer, who came up in sales. He was also a key player in the early Cadillac, Henry Leland's Cadillac. And Walter Flanders, who was Henry Ford's product manager. He also supplied Henry Ford with 5,000 crankcases for his cars. EMF was formed by those three following the acquisition of Wayne and Northern automobile companies. Northern was established in Detroit, Michigan. Built for business was their slogan, founded in 1902, founded by Charles B. King, Jonathan Maxwell, and William Mentzer. Northern would build cars from 1902 through 1908. Ben Briscoe would persuade Jonathan Maxwell to leave and start a company with Briscoe called Maxwell. Northerns were mid to high-end cars. Maxwell was going to be aimed at a lower price point in the market. Wayne built cars from 1904 through 1908 in Detroit, Michigan, priced between $1,500 to $3,500. And they used 2-cylinder and 4-cylinder power plants, 16 through 50 horsepower. The car was named after General Anthony Wayne. In 1908, Wayne and Northern would merge. Managing interest in the firm was acquired by Barney Everett, who would partner with Walter Flanders and William Menser. And EMF would rise from the ashes of Northern and Wayne automobile companies. The new car EMF would put out the very next year was designed by William Kelly, who designed Wayne cars. The 1908 EMF was offered in 4 body styles, 30 horsepower 4-cylinder, and would be carried over for the 1909 model year. In 1908, Studebaker would contract EMF to sell their cars using Studebaker dealership network. So, in 1908, Studebaker sold electric cars. They sold the Studebaker Garford cars as well as the EMF cars. EMF got sort of a bad reputation over the years, ownerships making acronyms for each letter meaning something different, like every morning fix it or every mechanical fault, externally missing fire. It's important to point out that by this point, Studebaker doesn't have a factory to build gasoline-powered rigs. That's why they partnered with both Garford and EMF. It gave Studebaker a gasoline-powered option to offer its customers, whereas it gave Garford and EMF exposure and the ability to sell cars. Studebaker had a massive dealership network at this point, like 4,000 different dealerships across the U.S. Studebaker had a reputation for quality, and it didn't seem like EMF shared in that regard. Studebaker wasn't always the good guy, though. Around this time, Studebaker was trying to take control of either Garford or EMF through lawsuits. Studebaker got a taste of what the automotive world was, and they wanted to be a more permanent manufacturer. Instead of sharing the spotlight with other manufacturers, Studebaker wanted to offer the product themselves. Garford was able to block Studebaker, but EMF wasn't so lucky. Studebaker was able to take control over EMF by doing some pretty shitty things. In 2 states, they were able to prevent EMF of selling their own cars and denying them an injunction. They were also slow walking sales of EMFs at their other dealership locations, trying to force EMF into bankruptcy. It's also important to mention that not all the partners were happy with the arrangement that Studebaker made with Walter Flanders. Menser and Everett wasn't crazy about the deal because wholesale wasn't an option, which is a way for companies to move product so it's not just sitting around taking up space. Metzger and Everett would leave the company by 1909, starting a new company. The new company would be called Metzger, and their car was to be the Everett, leaving Flanders to sink or swim at EMF, battling Studebaker on his own. As a response to Studebaker not selling EMF products, Flanders would terminate the sales agreement, which triggered Studebaker, and the lawsuits started flying. Studebaker would hire J.P. Morgan to secretly buy stock shares for Studebaker, and by 1910, they bought enough stock to take a controlling interest in the company. But J.P. Morgan would sell his shares to Goldman Sachs, who forced Studebaker to reincorporate as Studebaker Corporation. And then they would merge the EMF company and the prior Studebaker Brothers Corporation into it. After taking over EMF, the Studebaker Garford contract expired. Garford would go on to build cars through 1913. The car line would be bought out by Willys Overland. Garford would continue to build trucks through 1933. The truck business was not part of the deal to Willys Overland. Walter Flanders would go off and start a new company called Flanders 20. The company produced cars from 1910 through 1911, all powered by a 20 horsepower inline 4-cylinder. After the Flanders 20, Walter Flanders would catch up with the other two, Everett and Metzger, where they were building the Everett. Walter Flanders would join those two. The trio would rename the car the Flanders 6 for the 1913 model year. After 1910, EMF became Studebaker, but it was still being sold as EMF. until 1913 when it transferred over to Studebaker. Studebaker's first gasoline-powered car came in 1913, and it was introduced as the SA-25. It came in two body styles, roadster and touring car, powered by a 25 horsepower four-cylinder. They also offered a six-cylinder model called the Model E that produced 40 horsepower. Production hit 35,410 units, placing Studebaker fourth in the industry for 1913. Studebaker would offer fours and sixes from 1913 through 1919. After 1919, Studebaker would drop the four-cylinder engine, bring an all-new light six in, and go all in on the six-cylinder engine in 1920, offering three different six-cylinder models: the light six, the special six, and the big six. Studebaker would keep that model lineup from 1920 through 1927, but in 1927, the names would start to appear for different series. Like Dictator was the standard 6 model, followed by the Special 6. It was so special it didn't really need a name. Commander, aka Big 6. President was also a Big 6. 1927, that's when these names started appearing. The man responsible for a lot of the change happening at Studebaker during this time was then Studebaker's president, Albert Russell Erskine, who would join Studebaker in 1911 as treasurer. He would work his way up through the company, becoming vice president in 1913, and then president 2 years later in 1915. Erskine guided Studebaker from the horse and buggy days into a major player in the modern automobile production. Erskine led Studebaker to prosper through the teens, 20s, into the 1930s. In 1927, Studebaker wanted to tap into a lower price offering. The lower price car was named Erskine after Albert Erskine, who was president of Studebaker. The car was known as the Little Aristocrat. Erskine was offered as a separate make from 1927 through 1930. It was powered by an inline six-cylinder. They had a better reception in Europe than they did over here in the US. After 1930, Erskine was unceremoniously absorbed into Studebaker. 1928 was a huge year for Studebaker. Their model line was now Dictator, Commander, President. They came out with an all-new engine, the Straight 8, which was 337 cubic inches in displacement, 5 main bearings for the crankshaft to ride on, producing a healthy 109 horsepower. Studebaker also took a controlling stake in a struggling high-end luxury brand, one of the 3 Ps of prestige, Pierce Arrow. Pierce Arrow would grow out of the Heinz Pierce Munshiner Company, which goes back to 1865 in Buffalo, New York. They built furniture, Gildan bird cages, and ice boxes. George N. Pierce would buy the other 2 partners out in 1872, calling his new company the George N. Pierce Company. In 1896, bicycles would be added to the menu. Tricycles would soon follow, engine-powered motorbikes and motorcycles, and then the automobile. Pierce would build their first automobile around 1900. They were originally going to build a steam car under license from Overland, but they couldn't get all the kinks worked out. So their first car was a single-cylinder car named the Motorette. But Pierce would be building bigger and better luxury cars by 1904. 1904 was the year of the Great Arrow. It was a solid-built car that won the Gildan Tour in 1905. President William Howard Taft's limousine was a 1909 Pierce Arrow. Pierce Arrow also had a truck line and bus line. All Pierce Arrows were powered by huge displacement engines, 453 cubic inch displacement to 825 cubic inch displacement, 7.4 to 13.4 liters, 4-cylinder and 6-cylinder engines. In 1910, Pierce would drop all 4 cylinders, focusing solely on the 6-cylinder power plant until the 8 would come later. George Pierce, the man who built the company, would also pass away in 1910 at the Lexington Hotel at the age of 64. 1914 was the year that Pierce Arrow would get its hallmark, its trademark headlight fenders, which gave the cars a unique distinction against all of the other cars that were on offer during the time. And at night, because of the headlight location, it gave the car a wider stance. Pierce would patent the lights in the fenders. Pierce would also offer conventional lights, which could be had instead of the fancy fender lights if the customer wished. As the 20s progressed, Pierce Arrow was looked upon as an old money company with the six-cylinder as their halo engine. Around that time, 1928, Studebaker would gain a controlling interest in Pierce Arrow. Studebaker wanted to offer a more luxurious, more upscale product. Pierce Arrow would give them the opportunity to do that. And with Studebaker's massive dealership network, it would give Pierce Arrow the opportunity to sell more cars. And for those back home keeping score, in 1928, Studebaker had an entry-level car with the Erskine. Studebaker and now Pierce Arrow as a luxury brand offering. Studebaker would control Pierce Arrow from 1928 through 1933, but it's important to stress that Pierce Arrow and Studebaker didn't fully merge. The two companies basically ran their own companies. It's also important to note that Erskine made himself president of Pierce Arrow during this time, but both companies were controlled as separate entities. Hardcore Pierce Arrow fans looked down upon the Studebaker years, but without the Studebaker years, Studebaker gave Pierce Arrow their second wind of sorts. 1929 would be the last year for the Pierce Arrow's massive six-cylinder power plant. In 1930, Pierce would get an all-new straight-eight engine, and they would go all in on the straight-eight, offering three different models, the Model A, B, and C, all powered by eight-cylinder straight-eight engines, making between 115 to 132 horsepower. The Pierce Arrow straight eight is hailed as being one of the best straight eights from this era. When it came out, it offered 9 main bearing crankshaft, hydraulic valve lifters, which was pretty unheard of in the 1930s. 2 years later, in 1932, they would get an all-new flagship Halo engine, the V12, which also got hydraulic lifters. 1933 saw the release of the Silver Arrow, which was the company's Halo car. The Silver Arrow was a huge departure of what an automobile was. No running boards, the fenders flowed with the body lines, and they integrated in with the front body work. It was a rolling sculpture, rolling art, with a price tag to match. It was $10,000, which would be equivalent to you spending $249,212.31 the year 2025. And Pierce Arrow evidently lost money on every single one ever built. Only 5 were ever made. Designed by Phil Wright, Pierce Arrow's V12 under the hood, making 175 horsepower, which was enough to move this 5,101 pound car to 115 miles per hour. Studebaker gave Pierce Arrow access to money that it didn't have, and with that money, they were able to create the Silver Arrow as well as the Straight 8 and the V12. Without Studebaker's involvement in the Pierce Arrow company, none of that would have happened. Albert Erskine would bring in his longtime friend, who was also a famed football Notre Dame coach, Knute Rockne. This partnership would not interfere with Knute's football commitments. Unfortunately, Knute would die in a plane crash just 12 days after signing the contract to become a manager under Erskine. So in Knute Rockne's honor, Albert Erskine would cancel the production of Erskine cars and would replace it with a new car called the Rockne. The Rockne would be produced From 1932 through 1933, it was priced between $585 and $795. They were powered by a Studebaker in line 6, producing 66 to 72 horsepower. But after all the good times, the bill finally came. By 1933, Studebaker wasn't doing so great. After taking a controlling stake in Pierce Arrow, the stock market would crash in 1929, but before the crash, Studebaker was in the black, and they were doing great. But when the stock market cratered, Albert Erskine failed to cut production costs in response to the slump, which led to insurmountable cash flow crisis in 1930. Studebaker wanted to survive the economic storm. They would seek refuge from an unlikely place, White Motor Company, which goes back to 1900, based in Cleveland, Ohio, until after World War II, mostly known as a commercial truck company, but they also made cars from 1900 through 1918. Studebaker would merge, well, sort of, with White in 1932. And I say sort of because a lot of White stockholders didn't want any part in the merger. The merger would only last 2 years. In 1934, White would reorganize as White. Studebaker would inevitably run out of money, going into receivership in 1933. While they were in receivership, Studebaker would sell Pierce Arrow to a group of Buffalo investors for $1 million. Pierce Arrow would soldier on without Studebaker. They would see two major redesigns, the last one appearing in 1936 and would last until the end in 1938. Pierce never offered a lesser alternative other than power plant. They offered different levels of power plant, but only one level of car, whereas Packard, one of another 3 Ps of prestige, Peerless was the other one. Peerless, Packard, and Pierce Arrow were the 3 Ps of prestige. Packard was the only one of the 3 Ps of prestige and independent luxury car manufacturer to survive the Great Depression debacle. Packard watered down their brand with junior line of cars, the 120 appearing in 1935 and the even cheaper 115C appearing in 1937. Pierce Arrow did not want to water down their brand by selling less than prestigious vehicles. As sort of a last-ditch effort, Hail Mary, so to speak, Pierce would build a line of posh travel trailers, marketed as travel lodges, offered in 3 models and 3 different sizes. Model A was the biggest one, 19 feet long. Model B was 15.5 feet. Model C, 13.5 feet. They were nice. This was camping in style. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to save the company. Studebaker could not save them this time, and they went bust. Pierce Arrow was forced to liquidate. During the liquidation sale, Seagrave, which was in the business of building fire apparatuses since 1881, would buy the tooling and the rights to produce both the inline straight 8 and the V12. Both would power fire trucks in the coming decades. Meanwhile, back in 1933, feeling all alone, feeling like the reason for all of Studebaker's shortcomings was because of him, Albert Erskine was at the lowest point of his life. The once proud president of Studebaker was ousted from the company that he loved like a child. He felt alone. He felt like he couldn't recover from this. Unaliving himself. Look, I don't know where you are in life. You could be going through some serious stuff, but suicide is not the answer. If you need somebody to talk to, there's definitely people out there. Email me. Shoot me an email if you're going through some stuff. My email is what_it's_like@yahoo.com. Anyway, back over at Studebaker. The events that led to the bankruptcy, the stock market crashed, which is a complex topic that needs a full 30 minutes to understand all of the details. But one of the side effects to bank runs is that when people start cashing out at one time, nobody has any more money to hand out. Most other companies saw this and they proceeded with caution. Studebaker, on the other hand, they burned through their mountains of capital by paying high dividends to their stockholders. Albert Erskine was more or less in denial with how bad the actual recession was, thinking of it as an economic hiccup. Studebaker would run out of money on March 18th of 1933. Erskine was forced out. Erskine would be replaced with a duo, Harold Vance and Paul Hoffman, who were able to turn the company around, getting it back into the black, getting Studebaker out of receivership in 2 years. Studebaker through the 30s kept the names Dictator for the basement offering, which was a 6-cylinder, followed by Commander in the center, President at the top. Both the Commander and the President were powered by 8 cylinders. Studebaker made some drop-dead gorgeous designs throughout the 30s. In 1936, Studebaker wanted a fresh, more streamlined image, so they would reach out to Loewy Studios for design input. Loewy Studios was headed by Raymond Loewy, who was born in Paris, France, 1893. He would come to New York City, USA in 1919 after serving as captain in the French Navy. Finding work as a window designer, I know, very exciting job, but everybody starts out somewhere, and that is where Raymond Loewy started in the States. But in addition to that job, he was also the fashion illustrator for Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. He worked for various companies like Westinghouse, Hupmobile. He is responsible for designing the 1934 through 1935 Hupmobile Aero Coupe. Absolutely drop dead gorgeous, overlooked, underappreciated design. He even designed the cold spot refrigerator for Sears Roebuck stores. In the early 30s, Raymond Loewy would get a job with the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad was looking for a streamlined, more modern Art Deco design for their all-new GG1 electric, which would operate into the 1980s. Loewy designed other locomobiles for the Pennsylvania Railroad, which included but not limited to the S1 as well as the T1 duplex. In 1946, he was commissioned to redesign Baldwin Diesel, giving it a more distinctive shark nose. In 1937, Studebaker would offer an all-new product called the Coupe Utility Express option. People think the Ranchero was the first car-based truck, but this predates it, and this one's not even the first one. The first one, it's a bit complicated to track down. This was Studebaker's answer to the Hudson Big Boy, which was Hudson's car-based truck offering. It's also important to note that Studebaker has a truck line going half-ton all the way up to the big commercial. They offer cab over as well as standard cab. The Coupe Express is based on a car chassis. Studebaker would offer the Coupe Express for only 3 years, 1937, 38, and 39. Each model year is a different body style. The model lines would still be broken up as Dictator, Commander, President until 1937. In 1938, it goes to Commander 6, State, President were the only 2 models. 1939, the base model becomes Champion. Top model is State President. 1940, it goes to Champion, Commander, President without the state. Loewy Studios would be employed by Studebaker in 1938 to do all of their designs going forward. Loewy would design an all-new Art Deco Studebaker logo in 1938. The 1938 Studebaker lights are interesting. 1 year only, Loewy-inspired concept, shrouded lantern-styled headlamps. Loewy wasn't a one-man show. He had associates that did a lot of the legwork for him, and Loewy just would put his slap of approval on it, so to speak, before going out the door. Also, I'm not saying that Raymond Loewy did not design anything. I'm just saying that it wasn't all him that did all of the work. He had associates that worked for him. His associates included, but not limited to, Vince Gardner, Audrey Moore Hodges, Bob Bjork, and Virgil Exner. Loewy operated a complete styling studio for Studebaker. The Loewy-Studebaker partnership would last until 1956, when Studebaker could no longer pay the seven figures Raymond Loewy would demand for designing some simple things. But we're getting a bit hasty. We don't really want to get ahead of ourselves. Studebaker design gradually integrated the fender into the front of the bodywork. Models were still being called Champion, Commander, President through 1942. On December 7th, 1941, Japan would attack Pearl Harbor, which was the event which got the United States involved in World War II. Automotive production would carry on until February of 1942, when President Roosevelt would step in and bring civilian production of all kinds to a grinding halt, forcing manufacturers to produce supplies to aid in the war effort, and Studebaker was not exempt from that. Studebaker was responsible for building military trucks, tracked vehicles like the M29 Weasel. Studebaker also produced over 63,000 Wright Cyclone engines, which was a radial type engine used in the B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. After the war, Studebaker was the first company by far with an all-new post-war car in 1947. The all-new Studebaker had fenders, both in the front and the rear, that were more integrated into the car. Virgil Exner took some liberties designing this car, going behind Loewy's back. And when the changes were seen by Loewy on the final product, Exner was fired from Loewy Studios. Studebaker would hire Exner to work for them, but Exner and Raymond Loewy would continue to butt heads until Loewy would pull rank and forced Studebaker to get rid of Virgil Exner altogether. Exner would get a job over at Chrysler, and he would become Chrysler's chief of design and would lead the forward look. Exner's designs went from 1955 through 1962. 1947 also saw the release of the all-new Starlight Coupe, which featured a large background back glass. The Starlight Coupe would lead to the Bullet Nose, which was on offer from 1950 through 1951. 1951 was also the year that Studebaker would announce their very own V8. This V8 was built by Studebaker. It started off as a 232 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8, making 120 horsepower. It was the Commander V8. Studebaker would offer the Champion 6, which was a flathead 6, along with the Commander V8 from 1951 through 1955. The Starlight Coupe would evolve into the beautiful Speedster, and then the Golden Hawk. And this is a reason that I absolutely love the 50s. It's because you can have two totally different looking cars that are practically the same underneath. They were doing all kinds of different design explorations, if you will. Look at the 50 Starlight Coupe and then the 51 Starlight Coupe. 52. Notice the 52 is the same body style as the 51. It just doesn't have the bullet nose anymore. 53. This is the first year of Bob Bjork's design. Even though Raymond Loewy took credit for the design, Bob Bjork is the guy that penned it. The 53 has these sleek looking horizontal grill bars. 1954 got the egg crate grill bars. 1955 got the bright catfish looking grill in the front. Speaking of catfish, in the early 50s, it was becoming more and more apparent that the big three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler Corporation, won. And there was no way that the independent companies, at which point included but not limited to Nash, Hudson, Kaiser Frazer, Crosley, Willys, Packard, and Studebaker, could not compete the big three alone. That they should probably partner up and they might stand a better chance. George Mason of Nash Kevenator, was in talks with Hudson, Packard, and Studebaker to all come in and be the big three versus everyone else. George Mason wanted to give the reins of this new company to his protege, George Robney, who was George Mason's right-hand man. But disputes over leadership caused Nash and Hudson to walk into the sunset together and to form AMC, leaving both Packard and Studebaker in a bit of an awkward situation. Packard was in the black at this point in time, but they wanted a partner for stability. Packard was a prestigious luxury American brand founded in 1899 as a response to "you think you can build one better than me" comment. After founding member George Weiss had a less than satisfactory experience with his Winton product. I mean, my guy paid good money for a horseless carriage contraption that was always broke. Packard's first car was built in Warren, Ohio on November 6th of 1899. Packards were known for being a well-balanced, very refined automobile. They were owned by heads of state and very wealthy people. Packards could be had with either a factory-built body, or one could buy the chassis and have any coach builder build any body of their choice on the platform. That's the caliber of car Packard was, with their slogan, "Ask the man who owns one." During the war, Packard built the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine under license. You know, the engine that won the war. After the war, Packard kind of lost their way. Coach-built cars pretty much died in the war. And after the war, the world was a totally different world in a lot of ways. Packard stumbled through the remaining 40 years with boring, bloated bathtub designs getting completely redesigned in 1951 with a more contemporary look. But like the previous models, they wasn't very Packard-like. Some people quipped that the styling resembled more of an Olds than a Packard. Packard wanted to survive the 50s, and they wanted a partner. Packard should have done their homework. But on October 1st of 1954, Packard bought Studebaker, not knowing how bad things were at Studebaker. Even though this merger was looked upon as a Packard takeover of Studebaker, Studebaker got to call a lot of the shots for whatever reason. Maybe it was because Curtis Wright also played a part in the deal. There's a lot of details in this deal that will take longer to go through than anybody left watching has time for. The merger was more or less the final nail in Packard's coffin. It pretty much solidified the end of that company. In 1953, Packard would get an all-new Halo car called the Caribbean. Dick Teague was brought in to jazz them up. 1955 was... It's a real shame because it took Packard, in my opinion, it took Packard until 1955 to find their way in the post-war American market. But by that point, it was too late. The 1955 through 1956 Packards kicked ass. They looked phenomenal doing it too. They looked menacing, and with good reason, because Packard is now sporting their new V8 under the hood. And what a V8 it was. It was available only for 2 years, 1955 and 1956. It was available in 3 displacement sizes, 320, 352, and 374. The 374 was capable of producing 310, a very healthy 310 horsepower. But Studebaker's money problems began to bleed into Packard's assets. To try to keep the banks happy, Studebaker would sell the Packard V8 engine to keep both companies afloat. 1956 is considered by many Packard enthusiasts to be the last year for Packard. Meanwhile, back over at Studebaker, the Speedster would evolve into the Golden Hawk. Studebaker's model line would change a little bit for 1956. They would offer the regular models as well as a Hawk for each model. So you would have the Champion and then the Flight Hawk, which would be powered by the same engine that powered the Champion. Then you had the Commander with the Power Hawk. President, Skyhawk, Golden Hawk was at the top. The Golden Hawk was Studebaker's halo car for 1956. It used Packard's 352 V8. It was the only Studebaker ever made to use a Packard engine, and it produced 275 horsepower. In 1957, Studebaker would enter a partnership with McCulloch, which would later become Paxton Superchargers. The only supercharged car that Studebaker would offer in the 50s was the Golden Hawk. In 1957, Studebaker would bore out their V8 to 289 cubic inch displacement. That, combined with the supercharger, made the smaller in displacement Studi V8 capable of the same performance that the Packard V8 did from the previous year. Studebaker offered a full range of cars in two-door, four-door, wagons, and truck flavors. The Golden Hawk would go until 1958 with the supercharger. There was a Silver Hawk that was offered alongside the Golden Hawk, but the Silver Hawk offered the 289 non-supercharged. After 1958, there was only one Hawk left, and it was the Silver Hawk body, but it was just called the Studebaker Hawk, and it could be available with the 6-cylinder or a V8. Also in 1957, Studebaker would partner with Mercedes-Benz to serve as their authorized importer. The partnership allowed Mercedes to sell their cars at over 4,000 Studebaker dealers across the United States. It also helped expand Mercedes-Benz's influence in the United States. And that's why Studebaker cars have that Mercedes-looking grille during this era. Studebaker, not having a lot of money, would take a page out of AMC's book, desperately needing to update their aging Flathead 6 with an overhead valve design. They would keep the bottom end and make a totally new head. Studebaker would enter the compact car segment in 1959 with a car called the Lark. The Lark was more or less the new Champion. It was Studebaker's basement model. Studebaker's model lineup from 1959 through 1962 was kind of bland and kind of boring. In 1961, Sherwood Egbert would bring back Raymond Loewy. This era of Studebaker could be considered Studebaker's second wind or the surge. Loewy would be tasked with designing a car for which the company would be remembered for. A swan song car of sorts called the Avanti. Egbert would also improve performance with the R program. Between the years of 1963 and 1964, there was R1 through R5, different levels of performance, available on Lark, Hawk GT, and the Avanti. The Hawk would receive its final form in 1962. The Avanti would make its debut in 1962. It was the only Studebaker to be completely made out of fiberglass. The body is made out of fiberglass. And it's a bit of a full circle moment for Raymond Loewy, because Raymond Loewy was considered to be the father of the streamlined design. The Avanti is like a modern interpretation of that. And unlike the Corvette, it's practical. There's enough room for 4 people in there. You could get mom and dad and 2 kids and maybe a dog and drive this car around. It was the fastest car in the world in 1962. 170 mile per hour theoretical top speed in an R3 flavored one, which was a 289 with a supercharger. With that setup, one went to the Bonneville Salt Flats and they broke 29 world records. Egbert planned on selling 20,000 units, but when the final tally of numbers finally totaled, the total output was only 1,200 units. Studebaker made some really interesting choices, which pretty much solidified the end of their automotive endeavors. In 1963, while all the cool, fun products were being sold, Studebaker would close one of their factories, which triggered rumor mills, the press running bad stories about Studebaker floundering, which was compounded by an NBC reporter, Chet Huntley's special TV report that he made titled Studebaker's Fight for Survival, which aired May 18th of 1962. Things got really bad after that. Sales came to a trickle. Egbert was ousted from the company and the South Bend plant would close. The last of the Larks, Hawks, and Avantis were built on December 26th to fulfill government contracts. The engine foundry would stay open until the contract expired. Studebaker only had one plant left in Canada. All Studebakers were built in Canada after 1964. Avanti Tooling and the rights and plant space was ultimately sold off to Leo Newman and Nate Altman. They would revive the car without Studebaker in 1965, and it would be called the Avanti 2. Things over at Studebaker were just looking pathetic at this point. Brooks Stevens did his best to come back and redesign the aging Lark into something fresh. And though the 64 through 66 designs do shed the curves, going to a more squared off look, more boxy appearance, it was new, but it didn't attract buyers. Studebaker needed to sell 20,000 cars to break even. In 1965, they did just shy of that, 18,588 units. But by 1966, production only yielded 2,045 units built during the calendar year. Other sources say they made up to 9,000 units. I'm not entirely sure where they got that number from. Maybe they truck units or whatever. But regardless, 9,000 units wasn't even half of the number that they needed to break even. There wasn't enough profit to justify spending the money to retool. And just like that, Studebaker just got up and left the auto industry. A lot of Studebaker's auto dealers would convert to Mercedes-Benz dealers after Studebaker quit the auto business. Interesting fact, or something interesting to point out, is Studebaker never went to an A-arm ball joint front suspension. They used kingpins the day they stopped making cars and just left the automobile business. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I loved putting it together. Which company history would you like to see featured here next year? Also, what is your favorite Studebaker of all time? Put it in the comment section below. Before going into the Would You Rather, I just wanted to thank you guys so much for watching this one. It took forever to put it together. And by forever, I mean I probably worked on it for a week. That's about as long as forever is for me. I just really like to get things done. Also, if this is your first time ever checking out the channel, welcome to What It's Like. I'm your host, Jay. I do cars in mini documentary episodes. I try to post between 3 to 5 episodes a week with engine episodes peppered in. This episode is what I call a long format episode. I try to do either 1 or 2 of these a month. If any of that sounds of interest to you, subscribe and hit the bell icon next to it to never miss a video. So that's going to do it for today. I was going to put a Would You Rather segment at the end of this episode, but it's glitching so much that I'm just really afraid of losing all of the work that I've worked so hard on. So that's why there isn't a Would You Rather today, or Name That Tune. But I love you guys. Thank you so much for watching this one. Until next time, toodaloo!